Chapter 114. Although, before I start, I must say that it's about a month since I've done any reading, so all the voices are probably going to be completely different. Oh well. Alright. The main concourse was a hive of activity, with hundreds and hundreds of people, soldiers, henchmen, office staff, white-coated scientists, hustling and bustling in every horizontal direction. For some reason I'd assumed that the train to OJ's place in the Peacock Ranch was the only line in or out, but a huge destination board displayed numerous arrivals and departures to places such as New York, Washington, D.C., Mashed Potato Mountain, Wyoming, Tokyo, Geneva, Stonehenge, and Gakona, Alaska, to name but a few. Lord knows how many people worked at the complex as a whole, but if the station was anything to go by, there must have been tens of thousands of them hurrying around somewhere deep beneath the Nevada desert. I looked over and saw a Starbucks kiosk staffed by a pretty curly-haired gal who reminded me of Rachel. Probably I could get some free hot water there, though in England that wasn't always a certainty, as they'd sometimes want to charge you for the cup, and in certain places, East Midlands Parkway for example, exorbitantly so. But this was the US, much more generous and believing in abundance, and I readied my tea bag and made to wander over. A hand on my arm stopped me, however.
"Where's your ID, son?"
A gruff southern drawl sounded.
"What kind of outfit do you call that? Where's your uniform?"
I looked and clocked a tall, older man with a strong, mustachioed face perched atop what was obviously a high-ranking soldier's uniform, all those little bands of colours and stripes and what have you, probably signifying how many children he'd beheaded in Vietnam, or how many Muslim weddings he'd rendered well and truly memorable for all the wrong reasons. Judging by the sheer number of them on this dude's chest, he'd gleefully and patriotically ruined entire generations of families, and all their cousins and their wives' cousins' families too. Happy Arab storekeepers droned to rubble and little baby gooks torpedoed with helicopters, all for a silly bit of fabric on a scared man's chest. Though probably that's a little unfair of me to say. Perhaps he'd never done anything of the sort, and perhaps he'd done something genuinely heroic after all, like, "At ease, General," I heard OJ say. I whirled around and saw them broadly smile at one another and then share a big manly hug.
"This sad-looking specimen," OJ said, "is with me, alas. He's the one I've been telling you about these past few weeks."
The General looked at me over OJ's shoulder.
"Apologies, sir," he said, stepping back. "I thought the homeless problem of above ground had finally reached us here. I figured he was going to start bumming for a dime or get his guitar out and sing some pinko commie liberal song about the evils of war."
OJ and the General laughed.
"This guy," OJ said to me, grabbing the General by the shoulder, "is the best friend a man can have down here. The grunts call him General Marion C. Mason, but if you stay on his good side, maybe one day he'll let you call him Mace."
I tried not to, but I couldn't help but smirk at the name. What was it with these American parents giving their baby boys girls' names? Didn't they realize they'd one day grow up to be proper manly men, and that dirty nobodies like me would snigger and feel superior to them, despite having no reason to, were we ranking one another on anything that actually mattered? Not even John Wayne had managed to dodge the madness, though at least he'd had the good sense to escape the travesties he'd been tarred with. Luckily, neither of them picked up on my smirk, and soon the three of us, along with a lieutenant and a major, were winding our way through the crowds in a little golf buggy contraption. OJ and the General sat up front, chatting away like two old maids, and me and the other two guys squeezed into the back, knees pressed up under our chins, shoulders sardined against one another's. It was very clearly only a four-person cart. Some oversight had been made here. I turned to one of the soldiers, the major, I think, his nose about 5 inches from mine, and introduced myself and asked him his name.
"Can't say," he said, stony-faced.
"Oh," I said, "fair enough, I understand. Top secret and all." I turned to the other guy, probably the lieutenant, his nose was even closer, and asked him the same question.
"Can't say," he said. "Not permitted."
"Okay," I said, "well, how about you just make one up then?"
"Can't do that," he said. "Still not permitted."
I furrowed my brow and squinted my eyes at him. Why wouldn't he be permitted to make up a name? And why was it okay for OJ to tell me the general's name, but not these guys? I looked up front to see if OJ and the general had overheard, but they were chatting away, the general taking his hand off the wheel every now and then to point something out, some new development, some improvement to the fascia, and OJ laughed and nodded and cajoled and listened. They seemed like the best of buds, as close or even closer than OJ and AC had seemed, which, in retrospect, given the hanging prank and the subsequent impalement, wasn't as close as I might have expected, judging by the way AC gushed over OJ. And thinking of that, and of the last time I'd seen AC, lying unconscious on the bed, my heart broke a little for that gentle giant, so obviously in love with his friend, but a friend who claimed to be responsible for thousands of innocent American deaths, and who had stabbed him without so much as a second thought when he believed his secret was out. What was it Rachel had said about OJ? Something about being careful around him, maybe not trusting him completely and watching my back? I couldn't remember exactly, but I seemed to recall it wasn't anything good. And despite his smiling round moon face and his twinkling brown eyes, I resolved to keep those words in mind, or, at least, a rough approximation of them, given that I seemed to have forgotten what she'd said. In the meantime, we had left the station behind, and were now travelling down a series of corridors. Buggies and carts approached us from the opposite direction, and each time we crossed one, everyone in each vehicle saluted everyone in the other, and it was more than a little annoying, given how squeezed in the three of us were in the back seat, arms forever going up and down, and nudging me this way and that. I just sat there with my arms pinned to my side, and shook my head with disgust. It was as daft as being in church and everyone always standing up and sitting down all the time, whereas me and my gran would just stay seated the whole way through, and when I finally sat down, for the last time, she'd wink at me and hand me a toffee and say, "See, I told you they'd make their mind up eventually." I turned to the major and said, "You can tell me your rank though, right?" He shook his head and kept stum. "How about you?" I said to the lieutenant. "Can you tell me his rank?" "He's a major," he said. And I breathed a sigh of relief, thankful I'd been right all along and wouldn't have to go back and change anything. "So wait," I said. "You can't tell me your own rank, but you can tell me the rank of somebody else." The lieutenant said nothing. Then the major told me the lieutenant could neither confirm nor deny whether that was the case. I turned to the major. "So he's not allowed to answer that question, but you're allowed to answer on his behalf." He said nothing. "Can you tell me his name?" I said, trying to work out the rules of the game. "He can," said the lieutenant, "and I can tell you his, but we can't reveal our own, and he can't answer questions like that." I shook my head. "That doesn't make any sense," I said, and then I remembered my tea bag squashed in my back pocket and hoped it hadn't split, or that it wasn't getting damp from my now sweaty arse squashed in between these two soldiers. OJ turned in the front seat and looked back to us. "But you're the one riding this shit," he said. "If it don't make any sense, that's your doing. Why don't you try a different tack?" Much as I might not have wanted to, I had to admit it. They were sage words from the man who could not be trusted. "Okay," I said, cutting to the chase. "This one's Major Tom, and this one's Lieutenant Dan. Actually, let's make him a captain. Captain Kirk. Lieutenant's way too difficult to spell anyway. And since this thing's only travelling at about 3 miles an hour, I'm going to get out and walk alongside and maybe stop off for a piss along the way, since I'd easily catch you up. And even if I take the time to wash my hands and finally get a drink from a tap somewhere, I'll still catch you up." I went to stand up and climb out, feeling suitably empowered, but I felt 2 strong hands placed on each of my shoulders, and I knew I was pinned to my seat. "Oh, mutiny, huh?" I said, flush with confidence. "But you know what us writers like to say? The penis is mightier than the swordfish. En garde!" The soldiers just looked at me curious, but I magically whipped out my laptop and started typing at a frantic rate. Suddenly, the look on Captain Kirk's face changed from one of strong determination to panic and terror. He was being written into oblivion right there and then, and he knew it. "Please," he cried, "I got a wife and kids." "Really?" I said. and an evil thought involving a traffic accident sprouted in my mind. Had, I said, you had a wife and kids. And just as he was about to cry out, "No!" for quite a few seconds, even though going mental and shouting something like, "Ah, you fucking twat, I want to rip your bastard head off, you motherfucker! Ah!" would have been more appropriate, he vanished from the cart, and Major Tom and I were able to stretch our legs and breathe freely once more. "You've got to admit," I said to my second Tom of the day, "that's a heck of a lot more comfortable." "True," said the Major, popping his hands behind his head and leaning back a little in his seat. "But you won't be able to get any more answers to your questions." Up front, OJ laughed, and then, quick as a flash, he snatched the laptop from me and dropped it in a trash can we were just that second passing. "Sorry, Marlon," he said, "but you can't imagine how dangerous that thing would be in the wrong hands. And any hands right now, especially yours, are dangerous." I looked back at the trash can and understood. "Ow, but what if somebody fishes it out?" I said. "Wouldn't they be able to take over the story?" "Instant incineration," he said. "We're very green down here." I looked at him dubiously. "You're sure?" I said. "Something about that don't seem right to me." "Those trash cans," said the General, swiveling in his seat, "lead directly to hell. The fire down there is hotter than just about anything else on this planet. Nothing could survive it, believe you me." "Hell," I said, "like where the devil lives." OJ chuckled. "Oh, there is no devil," he said, in my accent. "There is no devil," he said. "Even the Pope agrees with that. But I get your meaning." On they drove, facing forwards once again, seemingly assured that no wrong could come from this. But I wasn't so convinced. I had a bad feeling deep down in the pit of my stomach. Even if their fanciful notions of a trash can that led to hell were just a bit of light-hearted fun, what if somebody did get their hands on my laptop? Who knows what they could do if they took up the story, and what they might do to me? Also, and it bore thinking about, what if they weren't mucking about, and it did lead to hell? And what if the raging hellfires didn't burn it up, but instead it was caught by one of the devil's minions and delivered to his master? Jesus Christ! If the devil gets control of these words, there's no telling where it might end up. I turned to the Major and looked down at his hands. His fingers were stubby small things, like a bouquet of the cheap party sausages you get at weddings or kids' discos or funerals, the ones that come on sticks. They weren't fingers worthy of the name Tom by any stretch of the imagination, but something in my bones told me we were going to need all the help we could get. "Cross 'em, Tom," I said. To him, holding up my own pair of crossed fingers. I think something just went awfully wrong. But Tom just looked at me blank-faced, as though he didn't have a single thought in his beanie automaton brain, and OJ and the General were too intent on trying to race some other cart that was going maybe 2 meters per hour faster than us, and all in all, maybe Dan/Kirk, written out of existence like so many bit-part soldiers before him, would turn out to be the lucky one after all. Chapter 115. We pootled on for what seemed like an eternity, but in reality was only around 18 or 19 minutes. We passed many turn-offs for other areas, with each one progressively more guarded and secure. By Area 57, the doors were over 3 feet thick and manned by big burly Marines with guns the size of twin-necked guitars slung around their shoulders. By Area 62, enormous steel slabs were protected by a grid of laser beams that would fry anything that came near them, as OJ demonstrated with a beautiful, juicy, succulent apple that was reduced to ash. I could have wept for that apple and for the life-giving liquid it contained. They say we're 70 or 80% water, depending on the source. But is that by volume or weight? Either way, I was probably approaching single digits by this stage. The General appeared to read my mind. "Don't worry, Limey," he said. "Once we get to Area 66, you can have all the water you want. We got everything there, even water fountains. Unlimited and free.
Just press the button, and out it comes.
Yes, I thought, I know how a water fountain works. It's funny that they claim to have some of the world's, nay, the galaxy's, nay, the universe's most advanced technology, and yet this general here seemed more enthused and impressed by a water fountain. I could relate to that, though. The wonders of a smartphone or computer don't seem that spectacular to me, but to contemplate the technology behind the way a wax candle doesn't burn all the way in one go blows my mind. We are simple creatures who grow used to everything, yet even when we've mastered teleportation and shrink rays, we'll still go up amazed at some of the shits we drop in the toilet or the beating of a hummingbird's wings.
"Here we go," said OJ. "Buckle your seatbelts."
And given that he, the general, and the major were all doing theirs, even though we were still trundling along at barely a Zimmer-framed old woman's walking pace, I figured I'd do the same. And then, "Whoa!" we all said, as the buggy instantly picked up speed and jetted through an infinite black space where time and meaning were meaningless, where the stars were so numerous and close I could have reached out and touched them, were my arms not pinned to my seat by the G-force, and where I suddenly realized I didn't actually exist in the way I'd previously thought. It was over in a span of seconds, but another part of me felt I'd just lived several lifetimes, all at once. "Pretty cool, huh?" said the general, unbuckling his seatbelt and turning around to face me. "That's brand new this year. Before that, it would have taken us over 5 minutes to finish that last bit of the journey." I turned around to check behind me and saw what appeared to be some sort of portal, a swirling mass of energy filled with galaxies and nebulae. I went to reach out my hand, but the major stopped me. "You don't want to do that," he said, "unless you want to see your fingers vaporized and transported somewhere out past Jupiter, and probably made 1/2 kilometer long. In the buggy, we're cool, but outside of it, anything's possible." I withdrew my hand. It was so hypnotic staring into the patterns and the soup of colors, and then everyone around me laughed. OJ flipped a switch, and the soup disappeared. In its place, simply a long corridor with some kind of conveyor belt on the floor.
"Just a fancy light show," he said, "but neat nonetheless, and it does save time."
I took one last look and turned back around, disappointed. How many more times were they going to pull the rug out from under me? How many times till I said, "Enough is enough," and got sick of the whole thing and left them to it? Probably a few. I just couldn't resist wanting to know what would happen next, and so I kept on going. Everyone got out of the buggy. I looked and saw that we were at an old wooden door, so dilapidated and crusty in comparison to everything we'd seen before. On it, I could just make out a faded sign dangling on a hook. 9, kind of .99 it said, but the point was at the top of where the numbers are rather than the bottom. That's weird, I thought. I remembered going past Area 66, and Area 66.1, and Area 66.2, and a few more besides. But how did we suddenly get to Area 9.99? OJ reached out and gave the sign a little nudge and let it swing a few times. Beneath it was a handwritten "Closed for repairs" notice, stuck to the door with duct tape. "Sometimes," said the general, placing his hand on the handle, as normal as any door handle in the world, "the best place to hide things is in plain sight." He's not very gruff anymore, is he? But never mind. He turned the handle and suddenly we were in a utopia of activity, an enormous multi-leveled room with see-through walkways and elevators zooming this way and that, except elevators that weren't actually attached to anything, just free-floating and able to turn corners and travel horizontally too. Everywhere I looked, boffins in glasses and white coats carried clipboards, pens behind their ears and furrowed brows while they worked on equations and formulae. Through huge perspex windows I could see experiments taking place, explosions, plutonium rods being carried by people in huge helmeted suits and dropped into cooking pots, mice changing into monkeys, changing into rabbits, changing into hats, and even one of those DMC DeLoreans like in Back to the Future. It was magnificent to behold. Every direction I looked, I saw something fantastical and wild. I turned to the General. "These water fountains you mentioned," I said. "Where can I find one? I'm parched." And just before OJ could begin to mouth the words, "No time for that," I spotted one over his shoulder and ran over to it and drank to my heart's content. And in that delicious moment of revitalizing hydration, and H2O suddenly seeping into my poor shriveled brain cells, it really was the most marvelous technology ever, and the greatest miracle too. Chapter 116. We were taken to a large meeting room and served sandwiches and fruit and tea. I was impressed that they'd provided some green jasmine tea, even if it was only Safeway's own brand, and made myself 3 cups of the stuff, just in case they planned to whisk me away somewhere at short notice. I kept them close to me at all times. I never wanted to be that thirsty ever again. The meeting room looked out over the entire complex, and OJ and the General joined me in looking down on the scientists and soldiers carrying out their various tasks. Where the Major had gone to, I knew not, but I figured he'd served his purpose and was perhaps surplus to requirements. At least he'd escaped the fate of Captain Kirk, though perhaps being written out of existence and therefore never actually having to deal with the pains and tribulations of life wasn't such a bad way to be. I sipped my tea and pointed down to a room where a load of geeky guys were sat at computers tapping screens and clicking mice. "What are those guys up to?" I said, pointing at them with my sandwich and wincing as I accidentally dropped a bit of cheese over the edge and down into the central area several stories below. "Social media," said the General in my accent. "Twitter, Facebook, YouTube and 4chan. We have them spread disinformation and see who picks up on it. Rumors, gossip, fake news, conspiracy theories. Probably one of the best jobs here if you like that sort of thing. Maybe something you'd be interested in at some point in the future." "Just making stuff up all day long," said OJ. "Whatever mad thing comes into your head. You type it up and see what happens. It's a no-lose thing for them. If the idea falls flat, they just open another account and try again. Eventually, one of them hits the pay dirt." I watched as a group of 3 gathered around a screen and pointed and laughed. "That guy there," said the General, taking a bite of one of his own sandwiches and also dropping a bit of cheese over the balcony. "He's the one who came up with rebooting the flat earth theory a couple of years ago. We never thought it would take off, but man, there are some paranoid and dumb fucking idiots out there." He laughed. He shook his head. He took a bite of his sandwich and then coughed, because it was too soon after his laughter. "A few YouTube videos," said OJ, taking up the mantle while the General spluttered and choked. "A few Facebook groups here and there, and once you got it all up and running, and a few fish have taken the bait, they do the whole thing themselves. Same with chemtrails. We started that one in the late 90s, just with a couple of emails to some fat dudes living in the mom's basements. What's the name of that one guy?" he said to the General. "Fink," he coughed. "Richard Lou Go get some water," OJ said, to my utter amazement. 2 flipping hours I was desperate for water, and the moment the General starts choking and wants some, he gets it right away. Though, to be fair, it was sitting on the table right next to us. He poured out a glass, and I got myself one too, never sure when the next opportunity might come. "Right," said OJ. "Richard Lou Fink. Him and a couple of other guys. I mean, we sent those first few emails to hundreds of likely customers, but they were the ones who picked up on them. And look at it now. There are even semi-smart people out there who believe that commercial airliners are equipped with tanks full of toxic chemicals that pilots and engineers dump quite happily on their own cities and families, all okayed by the politicians and the military, even though it's falling on their heads too. And for what purpose? Some say mind control, the dumbing down of the nation, even though they think of themselves as waking up. While others say population control, somehow ignorant of the fact that the population is very clearly growing, that people are living longer, and that it completely contradicts their other notion of the powers that be, wanting as many slavish humans as possible so that they'll buy more things and make us rich.
I mean, them rich. As though we can't just print all the money we want in the first place. So, whichever way you look at it, it keeps them busy and looking elsewhere while we get on with the real deal.
Hey, but, I said, didn't you say at the beginning of the book that the planes that crashed into the Twin Towers were carrying chemtrail stuff, and that contributed to their collapse? OJ laughed, and the general hooted so uproariously that he started choking now on the water he'd been using to take his sandwich choke away, and involuntarily spat it over the edge. I looked down and saw a few faces sitting at a dining table turn to look upwards. They stood up from their chairs and walked away, and then one came back and took all 4 chairs and placed them upside down on the table, as if to say, "This table's not in use right now. Please sit elsewhere." How considerate, I thought, as another bit of my sandwich plummeted through the air and landed right where they'd been sitting. It was a miracle of technology, this building, but I wasn't sure whether the whole ultra-open concept had been properly thought through. People very rarely consider sandwiches when designing anything, I guess, but sandwiches are an intrinsic part of life and should always be factored in, as far as I could tell. My pondering and staring at the fleeing scientists below had given the guys time to calm down. I looked back at OJ and waited for an answer.
"So here's the thing," he said, composing himself and choosing his words carefully. "The reason we do this stuff is so we can find out who the real fruits are, who you want to stay away from when the shit hits the fan. Most people are pretty good at keeping their craziness to themselves. It's all just in their heads, in their thoughts, in the way they see the world. But if we give them some external thing they can focus their energies on, it all comes out, and then we can go, they're the loonies, put a tick in that box. We put all this stuff out there, the moon landing hoaxes, flat earth, the Bilderberg group, the Illuminati, 1,000 other nutty conspiracy theories, grand and small, and we monitor their Facebook profiles and their Twitter feeds and what they watch and comment on YouTube, and suddenly it's no longer hidden, it's there for all to see. At some point, the shit is going to hit the fan, and it's good to know who you want on your side. Also, when it comes to putting people in positions of power, we want to know how their mental faculties are. And you won't always get that from interviews and observations, but this works a treat. It's all just one big psyop. Well, 95% of it is anyway.
In the next few years, the general said, nodding in agreement, we're going to see some real interesting developments. Trump's going to play a pivotal role in helping to uncover the kooks. Sometimes he'll be doing it knowingly, sometimes accidentally, sometimes because of the way he is. Simply that. And there's a very special reason for that, because towards the end of his presidency, there's going to be a lot of challenges and changes and upheavals in the world. And I'm talking on a global scale here, not just centered on the U.S. Even your own country is going to be touched by this, Limey. Even your prime minister in quite a personal way. And though that whole thing's going to be big, I'm talking the likes of which we haven't seen on this planet for 100 years. Even that's just a dress rehearsal for what's to come. So this really is a critical time, and that's why we're so busy working on all these things, why we've worked so hard to all these past 30 years to get the internet up and running and connecting pretty much the whole entire planet together. And it's also why you, my friend, are here with us now. You thought you'd been hired to write a book. Well, that's just a small part of it. But all in good time. Let's have a bit of fruit and yogurt first. I turned to the table and watched as the general expertly whipped up a 3-man bowl of fruit salad. Something about the way he sliced the tops off the strawberries seemed oddly familiar. Something about the way he spooned the yogurt, and also his penchant for calling me Limey. But I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Thanks, AC, I said absent-mindedly, the way you sometimes call your teacher mum or dad, or the way you sometimes occasionally call your girlfriend by the dog's name, or one of your exes. Say what? Said the general, looking startled, but also smiling. Oh, nothing, I said, slip of the tongue. OJ and the general looked at one another. They seemed to ponder something for a few seconds, and then OJ nodded. The general put his fruit salad down, and then put his hand on my shoulder and told me not to be afraid. Afraid of what? I said. But even before I could finish the question, he had started tugging at the skin of his face, getting his nails under there and ripping at it with quite some force. I looked at OJ, and OJ just stood expectant. I turned back to the General, but he still just looked like the General, except a bit more red and raw around the neck and cheeks and chin. "Nah," he said, "just messing with you, Limey. You really thought I was going to pull my skin off and reveal I was actually someone else, right?" And he and OJ collapsed into fits of laughter, haphazardly sending bits of yogurt-covered banana tumbling over the edge. I just shook my head and turned away from them, and looked down into the room where the geeky guys were laughing over something one of them had posted on what looked like 4chan. And then I noticed some soldiers directed by whitecoats wheeling the DeLorean into a room just below ours. "Ah, it's almost time," said OJ, noticing the DeLorean too. "Hurry up and finish your fruit. If you want any more tea or water, now's the time. You still have that tea bag, by the way? The one from the motel in Boise?" "I sure do," I said, feeling around in my back pocket and reassuring myself it was still there. I should maybe sneak a couple of those green jasmines from here too, if the opportunity presents itself, and a sandwich or two for the road. "So where's the nearest toilet?" I said. "I gotta piss like crazy." OJ shook his head at me. "Why you always needing to piss?" he said. "You ain't seen me or the General piss once, have you?" "Limey got a bladder the size of a peanut," the General said. "Though I gotta say, I'm with him on this one. I could use a trip to the restroom too." He leaned over and pressed a little button on the balcony, and within a few seconds a transparent floating elevator smoothly glid into position in front of us. OJ opened a small door in the glass and ushered me in. "After you," I said. "I'm not sure I trust that thing." It looked sketchy as hell. The whole thing was so translucent it was barely there. And what was powering it? How was it hovering in the air like that? What was holding it up? OJ stepped in, and it wobbled not one bit. The General followed, and I finally took a step too. A door slid shut behind us. Against all my better judgment, I looked down and felt my bumhole quiver at the sight of the drop beneath us. There was something deeply wrong with this experience, and I didn't see the benefit of it being see-through at all. At least make the floor a solid colour, for people like me who don't like heights or the feeling of a quivering bumhole. Christ, I thought. And then doubly so when the thing went zooming upwards at several stories per second. I clung on to the General, and the pair of them just laughed and looked as comfortable as you like. It stopped and zigzagged to the side, and then we were at the gents. "Oh, flip," said the General, staring at a small yellow A-frame sign. "Clothes for cleaning." "Well, she'll just have to look the other way," I said. "I'm about to piss down my trouser leg." And really I was. I was already doing the dance. "How many goddamn teas did you have?" said OJ, noticing that I still had half a cup in my hand and a sandwich in the other. "We'll have to go to the women's," said the General in my accent. "I can't hold it in any longer." "Either that or piss in the elevator," I said. "But I don't think either of you want that." And then, "Oh shit," I said. "I dropped my sandwich." And we watched it go tumbling to the ground and land in some woman's plate with a splatter. What a threesome we were, hovering up there in a clear perspex box a couple of 100 feet above some of the world's most advanced technology and experiments and minds, 2/3 of us desperate to empty our bladders and raining bits of sandwich and fruit and water down on clever people's heads and food. But, to cut a long story short, we got our pisses, and we didn't have to use the ladies, and my sandwich didn't injure anyone, and I even fished an empty plastic bottle out of the bin and filled it from the tap for future drought times, and we were all fed and sated and replenished and watered and ready for the next bit, which was Chapter 117. "So this is where things get serious," said OJ, "where the whole thing has been leading to. I mean, you can still have your little buck. No one ain't going to take that away from you. But if you think that was the primary purpose for bringing you here, then..." "It wasn't," said the General. "Though I'm sure OJ will benefit from the confessional aspect. It is always good to get things off your chest. But here's the question. How can you receive forgiveness for something you haven't done yet?" The General stared at me, and OJ backed him up. I had no idea what he was talking about. why I was on the receiving end of a pair of purposeful stares, as though there was something I was supposed to get. I have no idea what you're talking about, I said. You mean there's something that he's going to do that this book will help him find forgiveness for, in addition to doing 9/11?
I haven't done 9/11, OJ said. Not yet.
I was flummoxed and perplexed. I can be a little bit slow sometimes, and since I'm sure you know what they're hinting at. But if you'd been there in the heat of the moment with those 4 beady eyes on you, maybe it wouldn't have dawned on you either. How easy it is to be the reader, or even to be the writer, looking back from the comfort of his desk and chair and room. But it's not always so easy to be the real-life, genuine guy who's right there in the middle of the situation, actually living the thing. Like what I am right now, kind of.